Hi, I'm Matt Hayes and this DVD is all about how to float fish. Now hopefully by the time you've watched this, even if you've never been float fishing before, you'll be able to catch a sizable fish. Well, that's the idea anyway. And if you're an experienced angler, don't worry, because although I'll show you the basics, the mechanics of float fishing, I'll also include a few tips for the more advanced angler as well. Now, I've come here today. This is Furnace Mill Fishery in Worcestershire. It's a lovely place and it's very typical of a number of the modern fisheries that have sprung up in recent years. And I'll tell you, I wish places like this had been around when I was a kid, because when I started float fishing, I had to learn to fish on the canal and all we could catch were tiny little gudgeon like this. If we caught a roach, it was a red letter day. But nowadays, thanks to places like Furnace Mill, even a novice angler can go along and catch a very big fish on his first visit to the water, and that's fantastic. I like Furnace Mill because it's a very quiet, sort of tranquil place. It's not one of the lunar landscape type fisheries that you find. You've got nice surroundings, a good mixed head of fish, and it's the perfect place to learn float fishing. Now in this DVD, I'm going to try to show you how to do 5 things. I'm going to tell you about the kit that you need to do the job. I'm going to show you how to set it up. I'm going to show you how to cast with it. With any luck, I'm going to show you how to play fish on it, and I'll also show you some advanced information about how to fish with different baits and to rig up to get the most out of those baits. So it's going to be a fairly action-packed video, plenty of information, and the first thing that we need to know really is what stuff do you need? Now this is the kit you need. This is a 13-foot float rod. Now over the years I've seen people float fishing with all manner of crazy things. I've seen people float fishing with beach casters. I've seen kids using little 6-foot rods on the basis that it's probably easier for them to handle. All of that is absolute rubbish. Modern carbon fibre that's now used to build fishing rods is so good that anyone can use a 13-foot rod like this. It's light, it's well balanced, and one thing you can always check out, when you buy a kit, put the reel on the rod, and before you walk out the shop with it, just check how balanced it is, because if you buy the right stuff, you'll literally be able to balance the rod and the reel on one finger like this. And of course, when you can do that, it's light and very, very easy to use. Why do you need a 13-foot rod? Well, the answer is it will be easy for you to cast. You'll be able to pick the line up off the water much quicker and strike into fish more effectively. And when it comes to playing fish, you'll find that 13 feet is a very, very good length. It's perfect for all-round float fishing. This rod's made by my own company, Total Fishing Gear. It's a rod I developed myself, but there are lots of good float rods on the market. The key thing is make sure you buy a balanced outfit and one that feels really, really comfortable. Now I can tell you, this is the perfect kit to do the job. And there's something interesting that's happened in float fishing over the last few years, and that is that places like Furnace Mill have got bigger fish than we used to catch, and that means we need a slightly more powerful rod than we used to use, say 10 or even 15 years ago. We still want the same crisp action to the rod, but we want one with a little bit more power, so that if we hook one of the double-figure carp that swim in this lake, we're going to have a chance of actually putting some heat on them and landing the fish. Now we rate our rods with a line rating. This is the ideal one for commercial fisheries, 4 to 7 pounds. Most people these days for float fishing use 4 pounds line. And that's ideal because you'll be able to land big fish, but it's not so heavy that if you get into some roach or some tench or orf or whatever it is, that the rod will be overgunned for the job. So this one's a perfect compromise. When I hold the rod like this, it's quite rigid. That's because this is very high-grade carbon fibre. But when I hook a fish on it, it will bend. Now, this rod's got quite a fast tip speed. That's what you want for float fishing because it makes it much easier to cast and strike fish. But when I hook a fish on this rod, it will bend progressively right the way down to the butt. The harder the fish pulls, the more resistance it will encounter. It's quite soft on the tip, but it gets stiffer and stiffer as you move down the rod. That's important. You want the rod to bend so that the fish doesn't break you, but you also want that power in reserve in case you hook a big fish. It's really, really vital that you choose the right rod. This is a fixed spool reel. It's exactly the type of reel that you need to use for float fishing. How does it work? Well, there are a few basic features. Key features to look out for are the spool, the bail arm, the drag and the handle. Those are the key features that you need to look at. The reel's smooth, and when you wind it, it will retrieve line at a ratio of about 5 to 1. Now that's quite important. Some reels are made with what we call a high retrieve ratio, around 6 or 6.2 to 1, but you don't get much winding power with a reel like that. Something around 5 or 5.2 to 1 will give you the cranking power to handle bigger fish, and it's ideal. What are the other features of the reel? Well, the spool holds the line. We're going to come back to that in a moment. The bail arm's important. You open the bail arm for casting, close it when you're trying to wind in. The drag is located on the back of the reel, and that sets the amount of tension on the spool so that if we hook a fish, it can take line at a controlled rate. Basically, what we're looking for is the drag to give line smoothly under moderate pressure. We don't want it too stiff, we don't want it too loose. So setting the drag and having a good drag on the reel is important too. The handle, you want to be comfortable and easy to use. So this is an ideal fixed spool reel. And now for something really, really important. The spool. You'll notice that I've filled this spool up right to the lip. Not beyond, not miles under, but right to the lip. Why have I done that? Because in doing that, I'm going to be able to cast very easily. If you underfill the spool so the line doesn't come up to the edge of this lip here, you'll have a devil of a job casting out, because the line has to get across that lip in order to go through the rod rings. If you don't fill a reel up properly, you will cut down your casting distance and the ease with which you can cast dramatically. So what you need to do is wind on enough line so that you come right up to the edge of the spool. If you've never done it before, take it down your tackle shop and get him to show you how to do it. But it's very important that you fill that spool up correctly. Now, when you put on a reel for the first time, it's important that you understand what the bail arm does. When you're going to thread line through the rings of a rod, or you're going to cast, you open the bail arm. What does that do? It allows the line to flow freely off the front of the reel. You close the bail arm for fishing and for winding in. It's completely different, so that when you wind, the bail arm actually lays line onto the spool. So when you're going to thread line through the rod rings and you're starting fishing, first job is open the bail arm. Then when you've done that, you can thread the line through the rod rings. To close the bail arm, you can either do it manually, or more likely, one turn of the reel handle and over she goes. Two basic pieces of kit, the float and the shot. We'll come to the shot in a minute. I can make this as complicated as you like, but I'll make it simple. But for this sort of fishery, one like this is absolutely perfect. It's called a waggler float. It's attached bottom end only, so you don't thread it down through a couple of rubbers, just through the base of the float. And this shot loading, 3AA, is perfect. I can fish at all ranges with a float like this one, from reasonably long range to right down the margins. And you'll notice that it's got an inserted thin tip. In other words, a tip that's thinner than the main body of the float. And that gives us improved bite sensitivity. So if we've got shy biting fish, we're going to see those bites. If you use a float that's not very sensitive or too thick at the top, you'll miss bites, because fish will take the bait, feel the resistance caused by the thickness of the tip of the float, and they'll eject it before you can strike. So you want what we call an inserted tip. Now, another little useful bit of kit is this. This is what we call a quick change float adapter. They come in different types, but basically they're all the same. They plug onto the bottom of the float. There are occasions maybe when you'll want to change the float. You might need to use a much heavier float if you're fishing a long way out. You might want to change to a float with a different colour tip because you can see it easier. If that's the case, then by using one of these quick change adapters, you can basically change floats without having to remove all the stuff from your line and start tackling up all over again. It's ever such a simple operation. Just pull one float out and push the new one in. But 9 times out of 10, this float's ideal. So when you're going to thread the line through the rod rings, open the bail arm first so that the line can flow freely off the reel spool. Very, very important. Now, threading the rod rings isn't exactly rocket science, although what I should say is the first few are reasonably easy to do. And then, of course, the rod rings get smaller and it becomes a little bit more difficult. So those of you with dodgy eyesight might struggle a little bit, but you'll get there in the end. So just remember, take each ring at a time, ship the rod back, and just work at a comfortable distance away from you. Don't miss any guides out, incidentally, because that will come back and bite you on the bottom. You'll find that the line will stick to the rod blank if it rains. You won't be able to cast very well. It looks ugly and it's very irritating. You'll sit there fishing away thinking, I really should thread the line through that rod ring. And eventually you'll have to stop and do it anyway. So better to do it right first time. When you've done that, just close the bail arm of the reel and you're ready to put the float on. Now the way you attach this to the line is ever so simple. You just thread the line through the hole in the bottom of the adapter. If you haven't got a float adapter, don't worry about it. Just thread the line through the hole in the bottom of the float. It does the same job, but we use the adapter because we've got one attached. Just thread the line through, slide the float out up the line. Now, the next stage is to tie a loop in the end of your main line, because we're going to attach another piece of line to this, which is what we call our hook length. To do that, you need to be able to tie an overhand loop. It's ever so easy. Just double a length of line like this, back on itself, and take the doubled line and form another loop. So, just to go through that again, double over a length of line to form a loop, squeeze the two pieces of line together and form another loop. Take this miniature loop here and push it through the hole in the middle, and then pulling on the loop and on the two pieces of line, add a little bit of saliva. That stops the knot from being weakened as you pull it tight, and just pull. And what you're left with is a perfect little loop. Just trim off the tag, and there it is. Job's a good one. Now what we need to do is to attach a hook. Now you can tie up your own hook lengths. Generally speaking, when we're fishing with a float, we use a hook length. That's a short length of line with a hook attached to it that's of a lighter breaking strain than our main line. Why do we do that? Well, if we snag up and that bit of the hook length is of a lighter breaking strain than the main line, then all we're going to lose is a little bit of line and a hook, not the float. So we always make the hook length a little bit lighter than the main line. Now this main line is 4 pounds, and in here I've got some pre-tied hook lengths that are just over 3.5 pounds. So it's lighter than my main line. Now you can make up your own hook links, but if you're new to the game, and even experienced anglers use these, you can buy packets like this from the tackle shop of ready tied hook links. They're ever so good, dead reliable, the hooks are beautifully tied, and providing you know how, they're easy to use. To attach one to your main line is dead simple. First of all, you need to remove the hook from the packet. Take it out of the packet. Now I've seen people get into right messes trying to unravel these pre-tied hook links. It's not difficult provided you know how. Here's how you do it. Stick 2 fingers into the hole in the middle, and then take the loop at the end of the hook link or the hook, either or, and basically unravel it like so. And provided you do it that way, you're never going to get in a mess or in a tangle. Having done that, here's how you attach it. This is the loop at the end of my main line, this is the hook. I'm taking the hook through the loop in the end of my main line, and then I'm passing the hook through the loop in the end of the hook link. that's attached, if you like, to the line that's tied to the hook. So through the loop on your main line, through the loop on your hook link, and when you've done that, it's what we call a loop-to-loop connection, this. It tightens up nicely, nice tight connection, won't let you down, strong as you like, dead simple to do once you know how. And we're almost ready to start fishing, thankfully. However, we've got two jobs to do first. We've got to put some shot round the float and we've got to plumb the depth. And plumbing the depth, I tell you, is one of the absolute keys to catching a lot of fish. If you can't plumb the depth, you won't catch many fish, and that's what we're going to do next. The absolute key to catching fish on the float is knowing how deep the swim is. You must fix that float so that your bait is on the bottom. Now, there are styles of float fishing where you fish under depth with the bait up in the water, but even so, you still need to know how deep the swim is. Otherwise, how do you decide where to fix the float? And the other thing is, most of the fish you're going to catch on 90% of the fisheries in this country are going to be on the deck. So you need to know how deep the swim is. So what I'm going to say now might seem a little bit strange at first. I'm actually going to set this float at a nominal depth. I'm going to set it at about 3 foot deep. The reason being, most commercial fisheries in this country are between 3 and 8 feet deep. And what I'm going to do is set the float at a nominal depth, and then I'll use the plummet to fine tune it. So we're going to start off by fixing the float at 3 feet deep. Now, remember, this is a 3AA float. That's its shot loading. And shot come in all sorts of different sizes. You've got SSG, which are the really big ones, all the way down to number 8s. Now, AAA and AA shots are actually quite large. So I'm going to fix the float using slightly smaller number 1 shots. I'll have to use more shot, but because they're smaller, they'll be neater and it'll cast better and be even more tangle-free than it would be if I used AA's. Putting shot on the line is really easy. Each shot's got a split in it, that's why it's called a split shot. And you locate the line in that split and then just squeeze the shot with finger and thumb pressure so it sits neatly on the line. Slide the float down so it butts up against the shot, and then put another one using the same process on the other side. Now, to make the float sit up, I'm going to have to put a few number 1 shots on, and I'm going to start off by putting on about half a dozen. The shot won't sink the float down to its full extent, I know that, but I don't want it to at this stage for reasons you'll see in a moment. I want the float to sit up, but I don't want it to sink down to the tip. So I'm going to start off on this 3AA float by putting on 6 number 1 shots. And you can see that they're all sitting in a line like this. Then I'm going to drop the float in the water, make sure it stands up, which it does. Now that's perfect at this point. The float's standing up, but it's not sunk down to its sight tip. Later on, we do want it to be sunk to the sight tip, but at the moment, we're going to plumb the depth. And having plenty of the float shown above the water is very, very useful. I'm going to get the plummet now and show you why. Well, I've got 2 styles of plummet here. They both work. I've got this one, which we call a crocodile plummet. Hello. And this one, which doesn't speak, which has got cork in the bottom. They both work, both as effective. If anything, the crocodile plummet's easier to use, but I'll show you how to do the cork one, just in case you've got one of those or can only find that style in your tackle shop. Dead easy. Take the hook, thread the hook through the little hole at the top of the bell-shaped plummet, bring the line down the side of the plummet and push it into the cork so it hangs on the line like that. The crocodile one is even easier to use. Open the plummet, open the jaws up, open wide, clip him on. Now he won't damage your line. What he will do is tell you how deep it is out there. Now the important thing to remember is that this lake here is not even in depth. it's probably going to be shallower in the edge than it is in the middle, although that's not always true on all lakes. But what I'm trying to say is these depths are going to be all over the place. There's going to be deep sections of the lake and shallow sections. I'm going to show you how to plumb the depth, but what I want you to do when you go fishing is to use this technique to explore the swim. You'll find some areas are deeper than others. You might find little shelves or gullies, and knowing where those spots are really, really important, because fish congregate around shelves, they congregate in holes, they congregate on shallow areas, and knowing where those places are can help you to catch more fish. More importantly, if you're not catching in one area and you decide to switch from, say, the middle to the edge, you'll know that you've got to change the depth on your float. And I cannot emphasise enough, if you change from fishing one spot to another one, you must replumb the depth and get this right. Now, casting a plummet is really, really simple. It doesn't require any marathon gargantuan effort. It's basically an underarm swing. So we start off holding the rod like this with about 3 to 4 feet of line outside the rod tip. We push our finger against the spool to stop all the line coming off when we open the bail arm, which we've done now. You can see that if I release my finger, the line comes off. So it's very important that we trap that line. One finger pressure is fine, and then I'm going to set the float swinging by subtle movements of my left arm here, like a pendulum. Once you've got that pendulum movement going, you can let go on the forward swing and the float will travel out very, very nicely. So let's just go through that again. Open the bail arm, trap the line with your finger, set the pendulum swinging, and then on the forward stroke I'm going to let go of the line and out she goes. It's as simple as that. It's very important that you know how to cast a plummet, because to get an accurate depth reading you want the float to follow the plummet into the water. What we don't want is for the plummet to enter the line here and the float to be pulled through at a diagonal angle, because we're going to get an inaccurate reading. We almost want it to land in a heap. Not quite a heap, but we basically want the float to follow the plummet down the same hole as far as is possible. Now, you're not going to get it absolutely perfect, but provided that you get the right casting motion, you'll get the float close enough to the plummet that you're going to get an accurate depth reading. Now, one of the things we're going to do today is we're actually going to feed and fish a couple of different lines, but we're going to start off by fishing at a few rod lengths out, and we're going to feed closer in. We'll come on to that later, but let's just concentrate for the time being on plumbing the depth out there, perhaps 4 or 5 rod lengths into the lake. Nice easy swing and send it out there. Now, immediately I can see that the float has disappeared, and that tells me basically that I'm under depth. My float is not fixed deep enough for the swim. But if I bring it in and drop it here in the margins, it's ever so interesting because the float appears on the surface. Now that tells me that it's shallower here than it is out there. And that's important information, and that's why you need to replumb the depth every time you change the line that you're going to fish on. But let's just concentrate on fishing out there for a moment. So I've cast out, float's disappeared. I know that I'm not set deep enough. So what I'm going to do now is to move this float up the line by about 1 foot, 1/3 of a metre. I haven't squeezed the shots on too hard, so I'm able to do this fairly easily. I've now moved the shot and the float by about 1 foot. And I'm going to repeat the exercise, dropping the float back into the same area with the same casting motion at the new depth setting. And hey presto, the float's now standing up like a submarine's periscope, which tells me that I'm now over depth. So the actual depth lies somewhere between those two settings. The first cast the float sunk, now I've moved it up the line maybe a foot, and it's sticking right up. So the proper depth is somewhere between the two. Now, you might not get this right first time. You might fix the float at a certain depth, cast out, and it's straight on the surface. What have you got to do? Take some depth off. You might cast out, it disappears, you'll add a foot, it's still not up. Add another foot, it's still not up. Add another foot, and then it appears. So what I'm saying is you have to keep juggling with the depth until you get it dead right. So I've now added a foot, and I know that I'm actually fishing slightly too deep, and that the real depth lies somewhere between the first setting and the second setting. So what I'm going to do now is move it back down the line by about half that distance, about 6 inches, and I'm going to try again. And that's what I'm looking for. I can see the float, but only just. The tip is just sticking up above the surface, and that tells me that I've got it absolutely right. The float tip's just breaking surface, and the hook is sitting right on the bottom, not miles over depth, exactly right. So I now know that that area of the swim is exactly this deep. Now the point is this, if I just set this float at any depth on the line, I wouldn't have been set at the correct depth either for the middle, because I'd have been too shallow, or for the edge where I'd have been too deep. And what would happen is this, if I'm fishing too shallow, I probably wouldn't get any bites, and if I'm fishing miles over depth in the edge, I will get bites, but I won't see them because my setup won't be sensitive. What I've got here is the float set at the exact right depth. But when I start fishing, I'm probably going to be fishing a few inches over depth. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move the shots back up the line by about 3 or 4 inches, knowing that I'm going to be fishing over depth by exactly that amount. Now when you're fishing on a place like this, you usually fish either just a few inches over depth or with the bait just touching the bottom. But the point is, having moved it up by 3 or 4 inches, should I decide to fish with the bait just touching bottom, all I've got to do is move it back down the line by the same amount, and I know then I'm fishing absolutely dead depth, and it's really, really important. We're almost ready to fish now. The next task is to take the plummet off the line and make the final shotting adjustment so the float's absolutely perfectly set. Now the stage we're at now is we've got the float half shotted correctly. Now we've got to add the other shot. And people get into all kinds of messes with this. I've seen some wonderful shotting arrangements, really weird and wonderful. And people seemingly don't seem to think about where to put shots on the line. Well, for this style of fishing, let me tell you, the simplest way to do it is to start off by adding any further shots about half depth. That's where you want your first shot, and your final shot's probably going to be a few inches away from the hook. I like to add a small shot roughly for every couple of feet of depth, and that's all. You don't need loads and loads of shots down the line on a place like this. It's not especially large, there's no great big undertow to move the float out of position. Small shots are the order of the day. Now, the size of this shot you use down the line can be dictated by a number of things, but generally speaking, if you're fishing with things like maggots, very small baits, then you want to use fairly small, delicate shots. If you're fishing with big baits like luncheon meat, big pieces of bread or large particle style baits, then you can get away with using larger shots down the line, because basically the presentation of that bait will probably be slightly better with bigger shots. But we're going to start off by fishing with maggots, and we're going to use a mixture of number 8 shots down the line. So these small shots should be placed starting with the one nearest the hook. This is a number 8 shot, and I'm going to position that about 6 inches away from the hook. And this is a very important shot. This is one that we call the telltale. This is the one that registers the bites. Now the next shot goes about a foot above that first shot, and I'll talk about the gaps in a moment. And then finally we're going to increase that gap to 2 feet, and I'm going to put on a third shot now, and this will be my final one. If I was fishing a much deeper swim, I would keep on adding shots at 2 feet intervals until I'd reach the halfway point on the line. But because it's only about 4 feet deep here, then 3 shots is sufficient. Let's look at the gaps between the shots. That's very important. Here's our telltale. This is the one closest to the hook. The gap from the hook to the shot is about 6 inches. The next shot is slightly further away. I've increased the gap between the first shot and the second shot to about 10 inches. And then from the second shot to the third shot to about 2 feet. Any other shots I put on the line above that, if I was fishing a deeper swim, would be at 2 foot intervals. But maintaining these gaps and increasing the size of the gap between the first few shots is very important, because that will cut down on tangles. If you have a haphazard shotting arrangement, those shots will act against each other in the air and your rig will tangle up when you cast. But this way you should experience tangle-free fishing. So we've got a nice shotting arrangement there. The next thing to do is to test the float and see what effect the addition of those extra shots has had on the float. So what I'm going to do is basically drop it out to where I'll be fishing. And as you can see, the float's now sitting lower in the water, but it's not right yet. We've got the business end of the shotting right though. We've got our number 8 shots in position. And now what we've got to do to just fine tune this is to add a few more shots around the base of the float until we sink it to exactly the right depth. So I'm going to add a number 4 shot. That's because I think that's about the right size to shot this float down so that it's absolutely perfect. So I've added a number 4 shot under the base of the float. We're not putting any more shots down the line. That's not a bad guess, but I've still got a little bit too much sticking up. So again, around the base of the float, I'm going to fine tune by adding a number 6. Now I must stress that having put the shots down your line, the remaining shots that fine tune the setup are actually added to the base of the float. Now let's have a look with this number 6 on how things are looking. Much better. That's absolutely perfect. What we've got there is the merest tip of the float sticking up. Many people fish with far too much of the float showing. You don't want much at all. The lower the float is in the water, the more sensitive it will be to those bites and the more confident the bites will be. And that is absolutely sock on. Now we're ready to start fishing. So now we're ready to start fishing, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by fishing with maggots. Now the point with maggots is that they're brilliant for catching fish of all types. My initial objective is to catch a fish of any type. I just want to get some bites. Later on I'm going to switch to fishing down the edges and try and catch bigger fish by using bigger baits, but for the time being it's maggots. Now maggots are very easy to hook. They've got a thin end and a fat end, and to hook them, grasp the maggot lightly between forefinger and thumb and just nick the hook through the thinnest sliver of skin that you can at the blunt end without bursting the maggot, and you end up with a lovely lively hook bait. Probably the best thing I can do now is to start fishing, and then as we go along I can explain different parts of the game to you. Now the rig that I've come up with, the setup I've got, is absolutely perfect for maggots, and the reason being that I've got fairly small shots down the line. They're nicely spaced out so that they won't tangle, and I've also plumbed the depth so that I know that by the time the bottom shot reaches the limit of its drop, my bait's going to end up fishing just slightly over depth. But the point is that because I'm using fairly light shots with these maggots, I can intercept fish at any depth in the water column. Now, the feeding techniques for using maggot and catching any fish are different to the ones that you would use for catching a big fish, and I'll explain more about that later. But what you should do with maggots is feed little and often. And as those maggots begin to fall through the water, fish will move up off the bottom. Some fish will eat them off the bottom, some fish will eat them up in the water column. But because I'm not using heavy shots and my hook bait is falling slowly through the water, I can intercept fish at any point. And I'm fishing from the minute that the bait touches the surface of the water. And of course I'm fishing also effectively when it hits the limit of its drop and it's lying there on the bottom. Before I start fishing properly, one of the things I should explain to you is how to cast out. This is the bit that people get really badly wrong. And as I explained before when I was showing you how to plumb the depth, good casting is genuinely effortless. You see people swishing the rod, making massive efforts to try and cast that float as far as they can. They put all that effort in and then it literally falls in the edge. Why? Well, it could be down to poor technique, it could be down to an underfilled reel spool. And those are the two key important points. First of all, before you attempt the cast, remember that reel should be filled up to the lip with line. That will allow the line to fly off the reel friction free, and that won't hinder your casting potential. But to make a basic overhead cast with a waggler, the process is really quite simple. Start off with about 3 to 4 feet of line outside the rod tip. The float's just hanging there. You'll notice how I've got the reel grip. I've got 3 fingers forward of the reel seat, the reel handle, and I've got 1 finger behind. So that's my grip. Some people grip it like this. That's what I find the most comfortable. My thumb is facing forward on the rod handle. What I'm going to do now is use my forefinger to trap the line against the rod blank, against the handle like this, open the bail arm, bring the rod smoothly behind me till it's over my right shoulder, and if I want to, I can bring this rod right overhead and then I'll make the forward cast. Now you'll see that that float literally flies through the air when you get that simple action right. Let's just look at it again in a little bit more detail. And bear in mind, conditions today are very difficult because we've got a strong side wind, so casting isn't easy. There's no need to hurry a cast. You're in control until the moment that you let go of the line. We've got 3.5 to 4 feet of line outside the rod tip. I trap the line with my finger against the rod blank, against the handle. I open the bail arm. I've got my grip correct. My left hand now is going to take the butt of the rod and I'm going to bring it over my right shoulder slowly until I'm facing the direction I'm going to cast in. Now, how you cast, the final position is up to you. Some people prefer to have the rod at an angle over the right shoulder like this. Some people prefer to go directly overhead, but the motion is always the same. This part of the cast where you bring the float behind you is nice and slow, and the real work takes place in the final acceleration. So let's look now at the acceleration part of the cast. Once I bring the rod behind me, you've got to remember that that float is going to travel in the direction that the rod tip ends up facing. But the final part of the cast is the left hand is going to pull, the right hand is going to push, and imagine that you're trying to flick a little stone or a ball of clay off the tip of the rod. As you begin the forward stroke, pushing and pulling, you let go of the line. It's effortless, and that's what you need to practice. The rod does all the work, not you. That's the important point. The first part of the cast is very slow. The setup is nice and gentle, and then we flick forward and let go of the line. This hand pulls, this one pushes, and we fire slightly upwards and forwards. The key really to distance is when you release the line. That's the bit you'll need to practice. If you release the line too early, the float will dive down towards the water at a sharp angle. If you release the line too late, it'll go up in a steep climb. It'll still end up short, but it will literally go in a high trajectory. And so you can analyse any defects in your casting immediately. But a good cast sees that unhurried motion at the beginning and then that final shoot forward. And it really is as simple as that. Right, I think it's time to start fishing properly now. I'll explain other techniques as I go along. One of the things that you'll need to do once you've mastered casting out is feeding. Now, the way you feed and the amount you feed will have a great effect on what you catch and how much you catch. What we're trying to do at the moment by fishing with maggots is to just catch any fish. And with this technique, we usually use a feeding technique called little and often. The idea is to put a small amount of bait in at frequent intervals. We're going to use a catapult to do it. Now, most people when they go fishing will literally throw in a few handfuls of bait like this at the start of the session, and then you won't see them feed again at all quite often. That's wrong, especially when you're fishing with maggots. What we're trying to do is get the fish to compete out there in a bit of a frenzy, and that means feeding small amounts of bait, probably every minute or 2 minutes. That's the maximum duration there should be between when I put the next amount of feed in. So rather than throwing, let's say, 1,000 maggots in one hit, I might feed 1,000 maggots over the course of half an hour or 45 minutes by putting in literally a dozen or 20 maggots at a time. And that's really important. To feed properly at range, you need to use a catapult. And I'm feeding a dozen to 15 maggots each time. And by doing this, I've never got too much bait out in the swim at one go, but what I am going to get the fish to do is to compete. They'll notice those maggots raining down through the water. It'll attract fish into the swim, and once they find them, there's never quite enough there to satisfy them. So they're going to fight over those maggots. It means that sometimes I'll be able to catch fish up in the water before the hook bait's sunk. But of course, when it has sunk, having plumbed the depth, I'm fishing on the bottom. So I'm fishing accurately and effectively at all depths. So get the feeding right and you'll start to catch a lot of fish. Using a catapult's fairly straightforward. What you must remember is that the hand that you hold the catapult in is the lazy hand. It's the one that doesn't do the work. The active hand is the other one that holds the elastic at the back. To use a catapult, do this. Take a pinch of maggots, lock your right arm out rigid. It's not going to move. Hold the catapult sideways on at 90 degrees and allow this arm, the left arm, to do all the work. The distance you get depends on how far you stretch the elastic. But did you notice during that motion that this arm didn't move? It was this arm that pulled the elastic back and fired the bait out. That's how you use a catapult. And how about that? I'm into the first fish. Well, I've been feeding a little bit of bait out there. This one actually took on the bottom. That's what I meant about fishing effectively at all depths. Later on, I would expect some of these fish to... it's a little carp. It's a nice one. And it's a real good start. Today's not an easy day to fish because it's very, very windy. And if you can fish in these conditions, you can fish at any time. I'm off to a bit of a flyer there. I reckon that was my first proper cast. But there are a lot of fish here at Furnace Mill, and they are lovely fish as well. This is a beautiful little carp actually. It's a really pretty little fish. The other good thing about using barbless hooks is that the hooks are very easy to remove because there is no barb. And when you're handling fish, make sure your hands are wet. Wet your hands before you start fishing, and always put them back close to the water. Don't drop them from a great height and they'll go back just fine. So put another bait on. There's a few things I need to cover with you yet. I need to tell you about striking the fish. I need to explain more about playing the fish, but maybe we can do that a little bit later on if we hook something really big that really pulls back. One thing I must do is to explain to you about how to sink the line to stop your float drifting out of position after you've cast it out, because a lot of people really struggle with that. Just feed a little bit more bait first. Well, I'm into another fish now, and it's really interesting because the fish are now coming right up in the water. They're boiling on the surface as I catapult the maggots out. And that's a lovely fish, actually. Now that's a nice roach. I caught this one on the drop as the bait was falling through the water. And although this may not look a massive fish by modern standards, if you can catch roach, you can call yourself a fisherman. I was brought up fishing for these things, and they're absolutely lovely. You need to get your presentation dead right to catch roach. Well, I've made a really cracking start. Now today we've got really difficult conditions. It's extremely windy, and believe me, for the surface of the pool here at Furnace Mill to be rippled, it has to be windy because this is a beautifully sheltered spot. We're right here in a valley in the Wyre Forest, and normally it's very calm. I can tell you that way out there we've got 50-mile-an-hour winds forecast. It's not too bad here, but the problem is the wind we've got is blowing from the side. It's blowing from right to left. So what's happening? Well, unless I can sink my line, basically the float is getting pulled across the swim, and that makes the bait presentation unnatural, because once those maggots hit the water and start to sink, they don't go sideways, they go down. So if my bait's being dragged sideways, then I'm not going to get any bites. So I need to sink the line between the float and the rod tip to stop it from moving unnaturally through the swim. How do I do it? Well, first part of the operation you can do the day before you go fishing. Take the spool off your reel with the line on it and put it in a bowl full of diluted washing up liquid the night before the trip, and leave it to soak overnight. By the time you get up, that reel spool will have impregnated with the diluted washing up liquid solution, and the line will be thoroughly degreased, and that will help it to cut through the surface film and sink. The second part of the operation is what you do immediately after the cast. So we're going to make our cast as normal, and what I've done is I've gone beyond the area of the feed, and as soon as I make the cast, I plunge the rod tip below the surface and make several quick turns of the reel handle to bring the float back to where I want it to be fishing. Now what that does is it cuts the line through the surface film, sinks it, and it keeps that float dead in position all the time. Let's do it in proper time. I'm going to go out, I've gone long, rod tip down, crank back. And now what I've done is I've sunk the line between the float and the rod tip, and I've just hooked another fish. But the point is that the float will remain in position for as long as you want it to. And you know, that's interesting. I've had a carp, I've had a roach, I've got a beautiful little rudd. Look at that. Now this tells me that I've got the feeding pattern right, because these fish love to feed up in the water. You can tell the rudd from the roach because it's more golden in colour. It has very dark orange or red fins, and its mouth is quite peculiar. The bottom lip protrudes beyond the top lip, so it's got a sulky expression like that, and that tells me it's a surface feeder. So this is a fish that will feed up in the water, and it's beautiful, isn't it? Absolutely cracking little fish. Anyway, I'm going to pop him back. Well, things are going pretty well, really. I'm starting to get to grips with the fishing now. Of course, what I mustn't do is lose too much concentration while I'm yakking to you like this. I'll just show you one thing which is very useful when it's windy like this, but I don't expect you to get this straight away. But once you've got this casting timing right, you can actually cast off the opposite shoulder. Now, learning to do this is very useful when you've got a wind like this today, because what's happening is the wind is, oh, I had another bite then, I missed it. The wind is blowing from the right to the left, so it's blowing into my casting arm, my normal casting arm. Normally I'm coming off this shoulder. When the wind's blowing like this, I'll actually reverse and come across this shoulder. But you need a little bit of practice to do that. The reason I explain that is because we have got unusually windy conditions today. I'm using the same technique, but just with a little twist. And I didn't want you to think that I'm pulling a fast one on you, because I'm not. I'm just having to cope with a very awkward swirling wind here. Now, another key area, and one which a lot of people struggle with, is striking the fish. You'll notice first of all that I'm fishing in a really comfortable position. I've got the rod butt to hand here, it's resting across my knee. I've got the rod rest at the front angled so that the tip of the rod is always under the water. Now that's quite important on a windy day like this, because it keeps that line down and stops the float being whipped across the surface. So I'm sitting here in the correct position. If I get a bite now, I'm in a perfect position to strike. And the way that you strike is with a sharp upward movement, sometimes slightly sideways as well, of the rod. Basically, you want to move that line in the opposite direction to the way it's facing and strike like that over your shoulder. And that way, if you make a sharp upward sweeping strike, you'll hook the fish. Now, when you're striking, it's a little ghost carp incidentally. I've had another species now. It's lovely, this. Beautiful little fish. Now, when you're striking, the power of the strike is really quite important. Most people actually tend to underdo it. They're almost frightened to strike. So let's just go through that again. We've cast out, drag the float back, put the rod on the rest. The tip is now under the surface. We get a bite and we strike. Now that strike should be a positive, sharp, upward movement, and most people favour striking to the side. Normally you strike in the opposite direction to the way the line's going. If there's a wind blowing, strike with the wind. Don't try and strike against it, go with it. So always favour the shoulder that's on the downwind side. If you try and strike against it, as you lift the line, the wind will literally put a bow into it and you won't come tight on the fish. So if you strike with the wind, in this case it's blowing right to left, so I'm going to strike up across this shoulder, you'll keep the line nice and tight. Now the biggest fault in striking, believe it or not, is that people don't strike hard enough. They're almost frightened to strike. They've got the float out there, they get a bite and they make a silly little upward flick like this, an apology for a strike. Remember, if your tackle's properly balanced, you've got the right rod to go with the line that you're using and the right style of rod, that tip will cushion the strike, so you can make a good, sharp, positive upward sweep of the rod and you won't break off. If you use a rod that's too heavy for the job, or a cheap rod that's literally very sloppy in its action, the heavy rod will break the line on the strike. The sloppy rod won't set the hook because the rod literally begins to wobble as you make the strike, and that loses power. So a proper rod and a sharp upward sweep will set the hook. Of course, you mustn't be tempted to strike too hard. The object of the exercise is not to pull the fish's head off, it's to literally put that hook into the fish's mouth. In order to do that, you've got to shift the line between the rod tip and the float before you put any movement into the hook at all. And that's why it should be a smooth, sharp, upward movement. And it's quite a considerable sweep that you make. A short flick is no good because that will barely move the line between the hook and the float. So you won't actually be moving the hook at all. You'll just literally twitch it. And more often than not, you'll bump the fish off or you'll just pull the bait straight back out of its mouth. So be positive, but not over aggressive. That's my advice. Well, I think I've demonstrated to you so far that it's not that difficult to get a bite on these places. The key really is learning to set your tackle up properly and to use a bait like maggots that will get you plenty of bites. Absolutely essential, of course, is to plumb the depth. You must know how deep the swim is that you're fishing. But if you feed correctly, little and often as I did there, you're going to catch all sorts of fish. Sometimes it'll be roach, might be small rudd, and then every now and again you'll tempt a big fish up and you'll get something like that carp I hooked earlier on. But there is a way on these places to regularly catch bigger than average fish. Now, if you're going to do that, what you need to do is to amend your approach, and you need to be fishing probably with different baits. You maybe need to fish a different area, and you'll probably need to use slightly stronger tackle. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change over my hook. I'm going to keep the same hook length, about 3.5 pound hook length, but I'm going to go up to a size 14 hook, and I'm going to replumb the depth. I'm also going to use bigger shots down the line. I'm going to change those number 8s for number 6s, same shotting pattern, bigger hook, same sort of hook length, and what I'm going to do is replumb the depth, and I'm going to fish right in the edge. Because on places like Furnace Mill, if you sit and feed the margins of the lake, you'll find often that the biggest fish will come right in. And if you get it right, sometimes you can almost get them feeding on the bank. Oh, crikey. No, I didn't need to strike then. I nearly took my rod off the rest. What a terrific bite that was. They're not all like that, folks. That's what happens when you use properly balanced tackle. So if that had been someone else's rod, that would never have happened. I've got the fish going crazy now. The reason is because I've fed the swim properly. It's as simple as that. Rather than just belt all the bait in one go, they're literally fighting for it. And as soon as it hits the waters, the fish come right up to the surface and they're grabbing it. But because I've got that light shotting pattern, I'm catching some fish off the bottom, but I'm catching some fish right up in the water. Now I'm just going to bring the drag up slightly. Now that I've hooked the fish. Remember what I said earlier on about having a correctly set drag? Well, you saw how ferocious that bite was. If my drag hadn't been set properly, that fish would have broken me right away. But because the drag was set properly and I could just tweak it up towards the end of the fight, I was able to land the fish. It just goes to show how aggressive these fish are. Now this is a lovely fish, this one. This is the sort of fish that I would have given my eye teeth for when I was a kid, because I never caught anything like this. All the fish I could ever catch were tiny, but the thought of hooking something like this that pulls back the way this fish did would just be mind-blowing. This one's almost like a cross between a common carp and a ghost carp. It's got definite ghost carp characteristics. It's got a silver white sort of effect on its body, and it's got this darkness around the skull area that makes it look like a skull in the water when you see it. It's almost like a skeleton fish. But they don't half fight. And there's never been a better time to go fishing, in my opinion. If you've never done it before, you can come to places like Furnace Mill and you can just have a whale of a time with fish like this. Superb. Right, let's slip this one back. Good, isn't it? Now, having just landed a big fish, I've tightened my drag up slightly, so remember, just fine-tune it again. If you alter that drag setting during the fight, make sure that when you come to cast out again, you've switched it back to where it was. It also illustrates an important point. That fish literally hooked itself. It almost ripped the rod off straight off the rest, and that just goes to show you why you should never leave a rod unattended. Just fishing for itself while you go for a walk up the bank to talk to your mate, or even a pee in the bushes. or whatever you're doing. Not that you should be peeing in the bushes here, because they've got beautiful toilet facilities. You know what I mean. Now we're ready for the really exciting bit, because we're going to be trying for some bigger fish. Now, while I was fishing with the maggots out there, I was also doing something else. I was feeding an area right down the margins of the swim. In these commercial fisheries, quite often you'll catch the biggest fish by fishing right in the edges, and you'll be surprised how close to the bank you can actually fish. But you'll notice one thing: I've changed my fishing position. Why? Because what I want to do is to fish along the bank so that I'm not right on top of the fish that I'm trying to feed and catch. These fish are literally going to be caught right off the rod tip, so I don't want to be right over the top of them. I want to be back from the water's edge fishing along the bank. With a 13-foot rod, I can literally lower it over the edge and right into position. I've made a couple of changes to my rig. I don't need to show you replumbing the depth again, but suffice to say that I have. I've used the plummet and I've reset the float at exactly the right depth for fishing in the margins. I've changed my hook length. I'm still using 3.5 pound hook length, but I'm on a size 14 extra strong barbless hook now for the bigger baits I'm going to be using. And instead of having number 8s down the line, I've changed the shots. I've got a number 6 telltale and a number 4 above that. Because these two shots are a bit heavier than the number 8s, I've had to take one shot off the base of the float and replace it with a smaller one, just to balance the setup. But when I drop this in the water, you'll notice I'm fishing with a little bit more of the float tip showing. Not the whole thing, but a bit more. The reason being that when the fish feed in the margins in a frenzied way, you'll get a lot of disturbance under the water, and if you've set the float too low, you'll be striking at false bites all the time, caused by the fish swimming into the line. So those are little tweaks that I've made, and I've already explained to you how to shot the float and how to plumb the depth. The feeding part of things is very, very important when you're going for the bigger fish. I've been feeding little and often, but to fish the margins and to go for the bigger fish, I've resorted to the tactic of throwing in handfuls of bait. So while I've been fishing with the maggots, I've literally been taking handfuls of pellets and sweet corn, luncheon meat, and just dropping them down the edge. And what's happened is, because that swim's been rested while I've been fishing out there, the fish have gained in confidence, and I now know that there are fish ready to be caught on the inside line. When you're going to go for big fish, you need to get quite a lot of bait on the deck, and you don't want the small fish intercepting it as it falls through the water, and that's why you throw it in handfuls. So what sort of baits are we talking about? Well, we need baits to feed and we need baits to put on the hook. Let's look at the feed first of all. Pellets. Now, most commercial fisheries these days allow pellets. They are a superb feed bait. You can also get hookable pellets as well to put on the hook. When I'm at Furnace Mill Fishery, I use the fishery's own pellets because that's the rules. A lot of fisheries have adopted this rule because they're concerned about people putting in inferior grade pellets and basically causing the fish health problems. So the best way to ensure consistency is for them to buy their own pellets and sell them to the anglers. So today I'm using the Furnace feed. I'm also using Furnace hook pellets. Generally speaking, my favourite pellets are made by Dynamite Baits. I'll admit that I'm a consultant for the company, but I think their bait is absolutely superb, and the marine halibut pellet is absolutely brilliant. It's probably the favourite pellet that I use. I can also use particles. I've got a few of them here. Frenzied hemp, much better than any hemp that you can prepare yourself. It's actually cooked in a sealed container which retains all the goodness that's boiled away in the bait if you boil it on your own, and you've got a fantastic fish attracting bait. I've got mixed particles down there. Now that might be a bait that you've never used before, but it's absolutely deadly. Inside that tin you've got all sorts of pulses and seeds, and the fish absolutely love mixed particles. Really good hook bait to use when you're particle fishing are maple peas, another Dynamite Baits product. Again, they're cooked in the tin and they retain all of that goodness, so you get a really strongly but naturally flavoured bait. And then of course we've got good old-fashioned sweet corn, one of the best particle baits of all time. Buy it in a tin, drop it in a bait box and bring it down here. And incidentally, I would advise you not to take tins onto fisheries. I've brought a couple here today because I want you to be able to see what bait I'm using, but put the stuff in a bait box and keep the place clean and tidy. Another good hook bait is luncheon meat. Now this is ordinary bacon grill chopped up into cubes, and I've flavoured it with some sauce liquid. It's another Dynamite Baits additive. It's a very rich aromatic flavour. You can really glug the bait in it, and I've just literally poured it all over the meat. And over a period of time that will soak in and it will make the meat really strongly flavoured, but the fish love the sauce. So I've got a good selection of baits, some to fish on the hook, some to feed into the swim. And talking about feeding, take a look at this lot. This swim is like a jacuzzi. Now I'm going to start off by fishing with sweet corn. This is one of the most popular baits everywhere. It's a great bait to use because it's very clean, it's very simple to hook. Choose yourself a nice grain, nice firm grain, nice shape, and literally just pull the hook through the corn so that it sits on the bend like that. It's very important you don't bury the hook in the corn and that the hook point is exposed so that you can hook the fish. You can use more than one grain if you want to, but again, if you put a second grain on, make sure that the point of the hook is always exposed and that the corn is hanging on the bend. Now, one of the great things about this style of fishing is that you don't have to cast out, or at least not very far. All you do is literally underarm it into the swim, and you're fishing with the bait literally off your rod tip. You can put the rod on a rest if you want to, or if you're expecting action, just have it like this, resting across your knee. It's another reason for using good balanced tackle. This swim is really literally bubbling up like a jacuzzi as I speak, and you can see what I mean about the float. If you watch it in close-up, it's constantly dipping and coming back up to the surface as the fish literally churn the bottom up while they're eating the pellets. Now, a good rule of thumb is to wait for the float to go under, wait a second or a couple of seconds, and then set the hook. If it's a line bite, the float will go down, but it will bob up fairly quickly. If it's a proper bite, normally the float will go down and just hold under for that second or two, allowing you to make your strike. Oh, there's a fish, straight away. Now the way this is plodding around, it doesn't feel like a carp. Oh, it's not, it's a bream actually. How about that? It's a nice one though. Now I was expecting to catch carp down there, but you know, these bream, they just love fishy baits, they love pellets. That's a really nice fish. When you're handling bigger fish and you're using a net, it's quite important that you basically protect the fish, so try and keep it in the mesh at all times and lay that mesh across your knees. Either that or use an unhooking mat, but don't just lay the fish down on a hard bank. Try and think about looking after it properly, and the easiest way is to keep it in the mesh, and it makes unhooking ever so easy. Now this is a different fish again. This one's a bream. When I was a kid, I used to read about bream in books, and yet, you know, I never caught one until I was about 13 years old because we just didn't have them in our area. Nowadays, at places like this, you get to catch all sorts of species, and it's wonderful for fish identification. This is a common or bronze bream. It's got a very deep body, purplish coloured fins, and a sort of greeny bronzy back, white belly, pearl white belly. It's a fish that's almost as deep as it is long. There's no mistaking a bream. They're also very, very slimy. So you need to make sure that you wash your hands after every one you catch, because you can't help but get some of their slime on you. If you fish with wet hands, you're unhooking the fish in the net. It's already nice and damp, so you're going to minimise the amount of slime that you take away from the fish. So that's another good idea. Unhooking the fish in the net to minimise any damage to the fish. Well, that one took a piece of luncheon meat, so I think I'll try another bit of sauce flavoured meat. Same deal really. When you hook meat, you want the hook point to be sticking out the side, not buried inside the bait. Very good hook bait meat because it's quite smelly, and in these coloured commercial fisheries, when the water is quite muddy, the fish are going to find it quite easily, and they love eating it, they really do. Well, that's a good start. Let's see if we can catch something even bigger now. Now I'm going to continue to feed handfuls of bait just to make sure that that bait gets down to the bottom and through the small nuisance fish that will try and intercept it on the way down. Well, I'm into another fish now. This one's really pulling. Now, remember what I said about having the drag correctly set on the reel? It's very important at times like this with a hard fighting fish. And the key to landing fish is to allow the rod to do the work. Do everything as smoothly as you possibly can and don't make any sudden movements. It's sudden movements that lose fish. Now this particular fish is trying to get into the rushes underneath my feet, and I'm going to use steady pressure hopefully to draw it out and get it back out into the open water, but it's very important that I don't make any sudden moves because that's what pulls the hook on the fish. And this one's been really awkward. It's come right underneath me. You'll notice that I'm keeping the rod up in the air and allowing the spring effect of the rod to do all of the work. That's what the rod is. It's a big spring when you're playing a fish, and you must keep the tip up in the air. If you point the rod at the fish, you'll lose the fish because the line will break. So allow the rod to work to its best effect. And this time we've got another species. This is amazing. I'm going right through the card today. I've got a tench this time, and it's a nice one too. There it is. Beautiful fish, the tench. Very muscular fish, green in colour, with slight flecks of gold across its tiny scales and large scallop-shaped fins. It's got a very powerful blunt tail, and it uses that tail to propel itself through the water very quickly. It's a very dogged and determined fighter is the tench, and I absolutely love catching them. I'm really going through the card now. I've caught all sorts of species of fish. I've caught more species of fish today than I've probably caught in the first 10 years of my fishing life, and that's the beauty of places like this. The opportunities are absolutely fantastic. The most important thing when you're playing fish is to have your drag set correctly, keep the rod up and allow the rod to absorb those lunges that the fish makes when it tries to bolt away. If I hook another fish, I'll show you how to overcome some of the other common faults that I see people making when they're playing fish. But for the time being, remember that the more smoothly you operate and the less hesitancy there is in your movements, the more fish you're going to land. Let the tackle do the work. And try not to panic. Not easy, but try not to. Well, that fish came on a soft hook pellet, so I'll try another one of these. These are very soft pellets made just as hook baits. You don't feed these. You just hook them on like that, again, leaving plenty of the point showing. Obviously a good bait to use when you're feeding with some pellets. Now this is one of the common problems that you see when people are playing fish. The drag's going like this and they're trying to wind against a slipping drag, getting absolutely nowhere And in actual fact, all I'm doing there is losing control over the fish and putting twist in the line. So it's very important that once you've set the drag properly, you then allow the drag to work and let the rod do the work. If the fish is running away from you and stripping line, don't try and wind in, let it go. When it stops, that's the time to recover line. And if it's taking line too easily, just tighten the drag up slightly, but never ever wind against a slipping drag. I've got another tench on now. There's obviously a few of them down there. And the great thing about tench is they fight so hard. They're superb fish. Now once again, I'm going to unhook the fish over the net so it doesn't have to touch the ground. They're like a bar of soap tench. They're very, very wiry, strong fish. Well, the action's really starting to hot up now. I'm hooking these fish by literally lifting into them rather than striking hard. Remember, the float's right under the rod tip, so you don't really need to leather the fish at all at that range. A sharp lift and you're into the fish. And again, notice that I'm letting the rod do the work and the drag on the reel. If that's properly set, you can cope with that initial rush of the fish rather than winding against a slipping drag. That's what the kit's there for. Keep the rod up in the air, always keep a bend in the rod. Don't try and horse the fish, but always keep the rod bent so that the fish is having to pull against that elastic. And if it runs underneath you, just try and lead it back out. If a fish runs hard to cover, then you can bring the rod down at a low angle like this and literally draw it away. We call that side strain. But I must emphasise that everything you do should be smooth and unhurried, even though your heart's probably pounding like a jackhammer. I know mine is, but the smoother I can do things, the more likely I am to land the fish. Now, this is quite a big tench, this one, so it's a good, powerful fish. And if I was to try and horse it, I'd probably break the line, but if I keep steady pressure up, nice bend in the rod, then I'm going to land him. The other thing you'll have noticed there is that I don't chase the fish with a net. I keep the net in one place and bring the fish across the net. That's very important. If you chase the fish around, you'll miss it, you'll frighten the fish at the last minute and it'll bolt away and maybe break your line. So everything has to be as smooth as you can possibly make it. Well, I'm certainly getting in among the tench. Be nice to get a carp now, I think. Oh, well, this one's really going. My mate Mick Brown would say this one's going like the girlfriend's sister here. It's gone shooting off across the lake. It's another tench. I'm really getting stuck into some quality tench here, and they're fighting like stink. Now, with the netting technique, as I said before, very important, bring the fish over the net and not the net to the fish. Because all these last minute lunges, if you chase the fish with a net, you can end up knocking it off. So do everything smoothly. Well, ordinarily I'd be expecting to catch carp down the edges, but I'm really getting stuck into some nice tench, and this is lovely fishing actually. We're building up a good bag of these fish now, and although We haven't got time to show you them all. Believe me, I'm getting regular action off them. And the more bait I put in, the more they're eating it. That one's a beauty. Now this one's really motoring off. This is almost certainly a carp, chugging around, and this is where I've got to basically allow the rod to do the work, allow the drag on the reel to do its work, and make no sudden movements. This is a much less frantic fish, but it's got a lot of power, and this is where having a rod that will deal with a fish like this becomes so important. You can see the way the rod's bending. The tip's nice and responsive. Notice I'm not winding yet because this fish is really going at full throttle, and only when it stops ploughing away will I basically try and take any line back off it. And to retrieve the line, basically I lift the rod very gently and then try and wind up any of the slack line that results. But at the moment the fish is still pulling quite hard. It's going round in circles under the rod tip, but it won't let me get any line back yet. I'm just going to let the tackle do its job. Now I can get some line back. It's just come towards me slightly. Still going round in circles. The beauty of the tackle that I'm using is that we caught some small fish on it, and we weren't hideously overgunned, but now that we've hooked something that can really pull back a bit, we've got the power to sort the fish out. And it's a nice common carp, this one. The other mistake people make when they try and land a fish is to have too short a line between the tip of the rod and the float. They keep winding until the float virtually ends up in the eyes of the rod, in the tip ring. Well, that's wrong. Basically, you need a reasonable length of line out, almost the equivalent length to the rod between the hook and the butt of the rod to actually land the fish. So otherwise you'll lose control completely and you will get smashed off. Oh, this one's really going. I've always reckoned that my mate Ed Brown that owns this place feeds these fish on steroids, and they really do fight these carp. Here he comes. Now he's ready for the net and he's in. Well, that's a really beautifully conditioned common carp. Absolute minter. And bear in mind that in this fishery, the next fish you hook could be a 20-pound carp. They actually grow that big here. Fish of 7, 8, 9 pounds and well into double figures are quite commonplace. And if I was to sit here and fish for another few hours, I'd expect to hook a few fish like that. But the weather forecast's really bad. I know it's going to rain fairly soon. And I think that's a cracking way to end this DVD. And we'll have another last look at him. Notice I'm holding him over the net, so if he falls out my hands, he's going to land in the mesh. He's a beauty, isn't he? You can't beat catching fish on the float. I'm going to put this one back. Well, he didn't want to hang around, did he? I think this has been absolutely brilliant. I've really enjoyed making this DVD. Now I know that if I carry on fishing here for a few more hours, I'm going to hook more fish like that one, and possibly even bigger. It's a sobering thought that here at Furnace Mill, some of these carp grow up to 20 pounds, double figure fish are caught regularly, and that's the case up and down the length and breadth of the country. That's why these fisheries are such great fun, and they're such great places to learn. I've had a brilliant time today putting theory into practice, and I think I've proved that if you get yourself the right tackle, you learn to set it up properly, you learn to cast efficiently and present your bait properly, you learn how to feed and how the way you feed can achieve different results, and then you pay attention to the way you play fish and not do anything in a hurried or rushed manner, but take your time and enjoy your fishing, then you can come down to a fishery like this one, and on your first attempt you can have a great day's fishing. Now, I don't expect you to get it right first time, and I guess that if you're new to fishing you might have to watch this DVD a few times over, but if you practice what I've shown you today, get those baits, get that kit, get yourself down here and bag up some of those fish, because I'll tell you, if you're a true fisherman, you'll never ever get bored of catching fish on a float. It's absolutely brilliant.